Montana Territory, 1878. A dusty street in a town that looks the other way. A crowd has gathered in front of the bank. A woman stands on a wooden platform holding her baby against her chest. The auctioneer is speaking in the pleasant, practiced voice of a man who has done this before. She is not crying. That is the first thing you notice. The bidding climbs. $80, 85. Then hoofbeats, a single rider pushing through the crowd. Trail dust, 3 days of hard riding on his face. A leather pouch hitting the table. $120. The crowd goes silent. The banker smiles and slips an envelope across the table. The rider doesn't read it. Not yet. The Battle of Chickamauga lasted 2 days. September 19th and 20th, 1863, North Georgia. The kind of fight that didn't leave room for thinking, only for surviving. And even surviving felt like something that happened to other people. Rye Callum was 17 years old and had been lying in the dirt for what felt like an hour, but was probably 3 minutes, which in a battle like that was about the same thing. His rifle was empty. His left side hurt in a way that meant something bad had happened to it. The tree line ahead was nothing but smoke and sound, and the particular chaos that happens when two very large groups of men decide to occupy the same piece of ground at the same time. He wasn't getting up. He'd made that decision, quietly, without drama. The way you make decisions when the alternative to the decision is moving. And then someone grabbed the back of his coat, not gently, not with any concern for Rye's comfort or his damaged left side, just grabbed the coat and hauled the way you haul a fence post out of frozen ground, with the determination of someone who has decided the fence post is going in, and that's the end of the conversation. "Get up, Callum." Rye got up. The man hauling him was 19 years old, dark-haired, built like someone who had grown up doing farm work before farm work was optional. He had blood on his left sleeve that was probably not his, though Rye didn't know that yet, and his face had the expression of someone who had long since stopped calculating odds and had moved on to simply executing the next necessary action. Amos Holt, Pennsylvania 9th Infantry, a man Rye had known for exactly 6 weeks and would know after this in the specific way that people know each other after they have survived something together, which is different from ordinary knowing, which is the kind of knowing that doesn't require words. "We're not done," Amos said. And they weren't. 15 years later, on a Tuesday morning in July of 1878, Rye Callum was frying salt pork on the stove of a small cabin in the foothills of the Gallatin Range in Montana Territory when he heard a horse outside. He didn't stop frying. A man came to your door in this part of the territory. He was either lost looking to buy cattle or looking for trouble, and 2 out of 3 of those things could wait until the pork was done. The knock came anyway. Rye took the pan off the heat, crossed the cabin in 4 steps, opened the door. The man outside was a rider he didn't know. Trail dust, exhausted horse. The look on his face of someone who has been carrying information he didn't want to be carrying and is relieved to finally put it down somewhere. "You Callum," the man said. "Yes." "Heard you knew a man named Holt. Amos Holt." Something went still in Rye's chest. Not grief exactly. He'd had 15 years to do his grieving, or whatever the thing was that he did instead of grieving, which mostly involved not thinking about certain things and working very long days. But the name still landed differently than other names. It always would. "I knew him," Rye said. "He's gone," the man said. "Died of fever, I heard, early this year." He shifted, uncomfortable with what he was about to say next. "His wife and baby, they're in Coldwater Flats right now. And there's a banker named Vane who's—" He stopped, started again. "They're holding what they're calling a labor contract auction for the debt today." Rye looked at him for a moment. Then he went inside, got his coat, got his hat, got his gun belt, which he almost hadn't bothered with and then decided to bother with. Came back to the door. "How far is Coldwater Flats from here?" he said. 3 hours, hard riding." Rye looked at the half-cooked salt pork on the stove. He left it there and went to saddle his horse. Coldwater Flats was the kind of town that had come into existence because it was on the way to somewhere else and had stayed in existence because enough people decided stopping was easier than continuing. Main Street, a few storefronts, a bank with new paint. A crowd gathered in front of the bank that was bigger than the town usually warranted on a Tuesday. Rye arrived at a canter and slowed to a walk through the outer edge of the crowd. He could hear the man at the front talking before he could see him. The voice was smooth, measured, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago that calm delivery made difficult things sound like ordinary things, and ordinary things were much harder to object to. On behalf of the Holt estate, the outstanding obligation represents $120 in principal and accrued interest, and per the terms of the original contract, the labor agreement attached to that obligation transfers with the debt. Rye pushed his horse forward. The crowd parted, not because anyone wanted to let him through, because a man on horseback moving with deliberate intention through a crowd that is standing still tends to create his own path, whether or not the crowd is cooperating. He saw the man at the front first, Silas Vane, about 50, a vest that cost more than most men in this crowd made in a month. Silver-haired, clean-shaved, standing next to a makeshift wooden platform with the careful posture of someone who had done this particular thing before and had long since stopped finding it uncomfortable. Then he saw the platform and the woman on it. She was 23 years old, though Rye didn't know that yet. Dark-haired, a traveling dress that had seen better days, but was worn with a certain deliberateness, the way a woman wears something when she has decided that appearances still matter, regardless of what the circumstances say about them. She was holding an infant against her chest, with both arms in the careful grip of someone who has decided that this specific thing is not moving regardless of what else happens. She was not crying. That was the first thing Rye noticed. Not the fear which was there visible in the set of her jaw and the slight rigidity of her shoulders, but underneath it, something else. Something that was not fear at all. She was watching. Her eyes moved across the crowd with slow, measured attention, memorizing faces, noting who was here, who was watching, who was looking away, who was calculating. Not a woman looking for rescue, a woman building a record. The bidding had reached $85. Rye didn't calculate, didn't assess, didn't do any of the things that a reasonable man might do when confronted with a situation of this complexity. 120, he said, his voice carried. It was a quiet voice usually, low-pitched, not the kind that filled rooms by nature, but there was something about the quality of it in that moment, some flatness that made the crowd go silent, the way crowds go silent when they realize the room has changed. Silas Vane turned. He was not surprised. That was what Rye noticed. Not startled, not thrown, just turned and looked at Rye with the measured expression of someone who has just received information he was expecting and is now fitting it into a plan that was already in motion. Sir Vane said pleasantly, "I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't," Rye said. He dismounted, walked to the front, reached into his coat and put a leather pouch on Vane's table. "That's $120, gold. That covers the debt and the interest." Vane looked at the pouch, looked at Rye. "May I ask your connection to the Holt estate?" "No," Rye said. A beat of silence. "I see," Vane said. He picked up the pouch, weighed it, set it back down. "Well, that being the case," he reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope. He set it on the table beside the pouch. "Your payment is accepted, Mr. Callum." "Mr. Callum." Vane's expression did not change. The fact that he didn't ask for the name again was interesting. The fact that he hadn't needed to was more interesting. "These are the associated documents, standard paperwork for a debt transfer of this nature. You'll want to review them." Rye picked up the envelope. He put it in his coat pocket without opening it. Because the salt pork was still on the stove back at the cabin, and the sun was already past noon, and there was a woman on a platform 20 feet away who had been standing there long enough, and Rye was not in this moment in the reading frame of mind. He walked to the platform, climbed the 3 steps, and for the first time he was close enough to see her face clearly. Green eyes, not the soft kind, the kind with light behind them, the kind that saw things and retained what they saw. Her hair had come partly loose from whatever she'd arranged it in for the morning, and there was a fine layer of travel dust on her dress, and she was holding that baby with the certainty of someone who has already decided that whatever happens next, the baby is going with her. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" Just that, not breathlessly, not with tears. A single word, clean and direct, the question of someone who has been in enough difficult situations to know that the most important information is always the motivation. "I knew your husband," Rai said. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a complete answer," she said. "No," he said. "It's not, but it's the one I have right now." Something moved in her expression. Not acceptance. She was deciding something. He could see her deciding at the rapid internal calculation of a woman who has very limited options and is trying to determine which of them is least likely to end badly. "I'm not yours," she said. Her voice was low and clear. "Whatever that man said, whatever he sold, I'm not property. You paid a debt, that's different." "Yes," Rai said. "It is." She looked at him another moment. Then she said, "All right then." And she walked down the steps herself. She didn't take his hand to do it, didn't wait for him to offer it, just shifted the baby to one arm, used the other hand on the railing, and walked down with the careful dignity of someone who has decided that this is how she is doing this, and the circumstances are not going to change that. Rai came down behind her. And behind him, Silas Vane watched them go with the expression of a man who is not concerned. Because a man who is not concerned does not need to be. The wagon Rai had ridden into town with was a rented one. Practical. Not comfortable particularly, but functional, which was the relevant quality. He helped her up, not because she needed it, because the baby made it awkward, and the baby was clearly not going to be set down. She settled on the bench, arranged Jessie on her lap, looked at the main street of Coldwater Flats as they pulled out of it. She looked at it with the thoroughness of someone who has decided that memory is the only record worth keeping. Then she faced forward. Neither of them spoke until they were clear of the town's edge, until the main street was behind them, and the road was open, and the dust and sound of Coldwater Flats was far enough away that something in the air changed. Then she said, "Clara Holt." Rai said, "Rai Callum." "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "How?" "The banker used your name when you paid, and you didn't correct him." Rai thought about that. "Fair," he said. They rode without talking for a while. The July sun was past its worst, but still considerable. Jessie slept in Clara's arms with a profound commitment to sleep that only infants and the very old manage, completely undisturbed by the heat and the road and the fact that the world had recently rearranged itself entirely around him. Finally, she said, "How did you know Amos?" Rai said. "Which part of the war?" "Chickamauga mostly, and before." "He never talked about it much," she said. "He'd mention names sometimes. Callum was one of them." She was quiet for a moment. "He made it sound like something funny had happened." "Something did," Rai said, "depending on how you define funny." She almost smiled. Almost. "He saved your life," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it like one. "Yes," he said. She looked at Jessie's sleeping face. "He didn't tell me that part. He said he just helped someone up." "That's one way to describe it." "Is it accurate?" "Partially." She nodded, slowly, processing this the way she seemed to process most things, completely and without hurry, whatever the external pressure. "And so," she said, "you came." "And so I came." The road to the Callum Ranch was not a good road. It was the kind of road that had been made by wagons going the same direction enough times that the ground gave up and stopped resisting, which was not the same as the ground cooperating. Rai drove it the way he drove everything, directly, without commentary, at a speed that prioritized arriving over comfort. Clara sat beside him and didn't complain. She also didn't look like a woman who needed to be entertained or reassured or told what was happening next. She watched the landscape with the same careful attention she'd given the crowd in Coldwater Flats, as though she was taking it in, not to admire it, but to understand it, to know what was here and what it could offer and what it could take away. Practical. He was used to practical. What he wasn't used to was practical coming in this particular form. They stopped at midday at a creek crossing he knew was reliable. She climbed down before he'd finished tying off the reins and went to a shaded spot by the water. He went the other direction and pretended to check the horse. When she came back, Jessie was awake and looking around at the world with the expression of an infant who has just realized the world is very large and is withholding judgment. Rye held out a canteen. Clara took it, drank, handed it back. "How far?" she said. "3 hours, less if the road holds." She nodded, looked at the road ahead. "The ranch," she said. "What's it like?" He thought about this for a moment. "Small," he said. 140 acres. Cabin, barn, corral. 30 head of cattle, more or less. A garden I mostly keep alive by accident." "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "I'm telling you there's a place to stay," he said. "What you decide about it is your decision." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not going to tell me it's going to be fine," she said. "I don't know if it's going to be fine," he said. Something in her expression shifted, something that might in different circumstances have been closer to relief. "All right," she said. "Show me this cabin." The Callum Ranch sat in a clearing at the base of the first real slope of the Gallatin foothills, where the open grasslands started giving way to pine, and the sky was still wide, but the mountains were close enough to be real. Small cabin, stone chimney, a barn that was solid if not beautiful. A garden to the east side that was in fact alive, though mostly due to good soil rather than consistent attention. Clara sat in the wagon and looked at it for a moment after they stopped. Not with disappointment, not with relief, with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. "Who built it?" she said. "I did," he said. "First 2 years I was here." She nodded slowly. Then she climbed down Jessie, still in her arms, and walked toward the front door like she already knew where it was. She did a full circuit of the cabin before she sat down. Not because he offered, because she decided to. She went through the main room, the small bedroom, the larder, the back door to the yard, and came back to the kitchen table with Jessie balanced on her hip and the expression of someone who has just done a professional assessment and is organizing her conclusions. "The garden's doing well," she said. "Mostly luck," he said. "The chimney will need checking before winter." "I know. The cellar latch is sticking. It'll freeze solid in January if you don't fix it." "I've been meaning to." She looked at him. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm observing." "I know that too," he said. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Jessie, who looked back at her with enormous equanimity. "I'll make supper," she said. "You probably eat badly." "Consistently badly," he said. "Good, then I'm already an improvement." He went out to tend the horses. He stood in the barn for a while afterward without doing much, just standing. The way a man stands when something large has happened and he hasn't yet figured out how to hold it. 6 years he'd been in this cabin. 6 years of salt pork and functional silence, and the rhythm of a man who had learned to want exactly as much as he had, which was a kind of peace, more or less. He'd given it about 3 hours to become something entirely different. He went back inside. She'd made something from the larder that smelled considerably better than anything he'd produced in 6 years. He didn't ask what was in it. He sat across from her at the table and they ate. Halfway through the meal, Jessie made a sound from the blanket she'd arranged for him in the corner. Not distress, just announcement, notifying them that he was still there and still had opinions. Clara glanced at him and then back at her plate. He'd quieted. "He does that," she said, "just checking in." "Does he do it much at night?" Rye said. "Less than he used to." She looked at Rye. "Does that concern you?" "It concerns me less than it would if he did it more." he said. She looked at him for a moment. That was almost a joke, she said. Almost, he said. The meal ended, the dishes needed doing, and she did them, and he dried them, which was not a thing he had done with another person in 6 years. And the rhythm of it, the handing and receiving, was strange, in the way that ordinary things become strange when you've been without them long enough to forget the shape of them. When it was done, he went to get the envelope, the one Vane had handed him on the table in Coldwater Flats. He'd been thinking about it all day, not constantly, not with any specific worry, but the way you think about something you've put in your pocket and haven't looked at yet because you've been occupied with other things and the thing in your pocket has been waiting. He sat at the table, opened it, read it again. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he got up and walked to the bedroom door and knocked. Quietly, because Jessie was probably asleep by now, and loud was not necessary when quiet would do the same work. Clara opened the door. Jessie was in her arms, almost asleep, making the small sounds of an infant in the process of losing the battle against unconsciousness. She looked at Rye's face. She read something in it immediately. He didn't know what it was she read exactly, but she found it fast. "What is it?" she said. "Vane gave me this when I paid," he said. He held out the envelope. He called it Associated Documents. I should have read it at the time. She took it with her free hand, looked at him, looked at the envelope. "Jessie's almost down," she said. "Whammon, give me 2 minutes." She went back in. He waited in the main room. 2 minutes approximately, and then she came out. Jessie, in whatever makeshift sleeping arrangement she'd sorted out. She sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the papers, and read. Her face was very still, the stillness of someone who is processing something significant and has decided not to react until they know what they're reacting to. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table. "This is a labor contract," she said. "Yes. It's attached to the debt as a separate obligation. It says I owe 1 year of labor to the holder of the debt." She looked up at him. "Which, now that you've paid, would be you." "I didn't agree to that," Rye said. "He handed it to me. I didn't sign anything." "I know." She looked back at the paper. "But that's what he wants. He's hoping you didn't read it, or that you'd come back to Coldwater Flats and dispute it on his ground." She tapped the date of signature. "This says Amos signed this 6 days before he died." Rye said nothing. "Amos was in bed for the last 3 weeks of his life," Clara said. "He couldn't walk to the door. He couldn't write." Her voice was even, completely even. "He did not sign this document." "You're sure?" "I am absolutely certain," she said. They sat with that for a moment. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the foothills were quiet in the way they were always quiet, that vast quiet that pressed in from all sides. Clara looked at the paper. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the crowd in Coldwater Flats, with the focus of someone building a case. "This signature was forged," she said. "Yes. And Vane has built a legal mechanism around a forged signature to try to enforce a contract that doesn't exist. That's how it looks." She was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been doing this?" she said. "I don't know," Rye said. "Yet." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm going to need to see records," she said. "County filings, land transfer documents, any contracts Vane has filed in the past several years." "The county clerk's office is in Whitefish Bend," he said. 2 hours from here." "How early does it open?" 8 in the morning, usually." Clara folded the document, folded it carefully, precisely along its original lines. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to Whitefish Bend." Rye looked at her. "I'll come with you," he said. "No," she said. "Two people asking questions about Vane attract twice the attention." She set the document on the table between them. One person going alone to look at public records is just a person going to look at public records. He thought about this. "You've done something like this before," he said. "My father was a teacher," she said. "He taught me to read contracts before he taught me to read novels. He said contracts were more dangerous. She stood up. He was right. She went back to the bedroom. Rye stayed at the table for a while after. He thought about Amos Holt, who had hauled him up out of the dirt at Chickamauga with no particular ceremony and approximately zero interest in Rye's opinion of the situation. Who had written to Rye's family when the Army told them Rye was dead, because Amos knew Rye was not dead, and had taken the time to write the letter himself by hand to correct the record. Who had died of fever in Montana Territory at 34 years old, leaving behind a wife who looked at forged documents the way other women looked at weather, with the attention of someone who knew how to read what was coming and had already begun to think about what to do about it. Rye blew out the lamp. He went to the small room off the barn he used when the cabin had other occupants, which had never been, and lay down on the cot and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about a man who had stood between him and a bullet 15 years ago, and about what that man's wife was going to find in the county clerk's office in the morning, and about Silas Vane standing in the street of Coldwater Flats smiling, handing over an envelope that contained a trap so carefully constructed that he hadn't bothered to hide it, because he'd done this before, and it had always worked before. Rye closed his eyes, not sleeping, just planning, which was at this point the same thing. Clara left before Rye was awake, which was saying something, because Rye was awake before most things that had eyes. He came out of the side room at 5:15 to find the cabin already warm. Coffee on the stove. Jessie in the wooden box she'd arranged as a crib, still sleeping, tucked in with the careful thoroughness of a woman who had learned that the difference between a baby who slept and a baby who didn't was often about 2 inches of additional blanket on the left side. And Clara, gone. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. She'd left a note on the table. Not a long one. 3 words back by noon. He read it twice. Then he poured himself the coffee she'd made and went to sit with Jessie, who slept on with the serene indifference of a person who had not yet been informed that the world had complications. Rye sat there and thought about Silas Vane, and the envelope, and the quality of Vane's smile when he'd handed it over. Not the smile of a man making a mistake, not the smile of a man doing something he was ashamed of, the smile of a man who had done this before, who had refined the mechanism over time, who had stood in front of enough audiences to know exactly how much legal language was required to make something unconscionable sound like standard procedure. The smile of a man who had never been caught, because nobody had ever looked closely enough, until this morning possibly. Jessie stirred. Rye looked at him. "She'll be back by noon," he said. Jessie seemed to accept this. The county clerk's office in Whitefish Bend opened at 8. Clara was there at 7:55. The clerk was a man in his 60s with reading glasses and the disposition of someone who had decided long ago that his primary professional obligation was to the filing system, and that people who wanted access to it were a secondary concern. He looked at Clara over the glasses when she came in, took in the traveling dress, the fact that she was alone, the leather journal she was carrying. "Help you," he said. "Land transfer records," she said, "for the county, last 10 years, and any contract filings with the name Vane attached." He didn't move immediately. "Those are public records," she said. "I know that," he said. "Then I'd like to see them," she said. "Please." She said please the way a woman said please when she was being polite, because it was efficient, not because she required the permission it implied. He took her to the records room. She was in there for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She read fast, always had. Her father had taught her that reading was not about moving your eyes across words, but about organizing information as it arrived, building a structure in your head before you'd finish the page, so that by the time you reached the end of something, you already knew what it meant. She went through the land transfer records first. What she found was this. Silas Vane had acquired 5 properties in the last 7 years, 3 of them through direct purchase, 2 of them through what the filings described as debt recovery procedures. The 2 debt recovery cases, she read those more carefully, both involved widowed landowners. Both involved original loan documents with Vane's bank that had been subsequently modified interest rates adjusted upward in the copies filed with the county, though whether those modifications reflected the original terms was impossible to determine from the county records alone. Both had ended with the landowner departing the county. She wrote down the names. Ruth Macklin, 1876. Lost 40 acres along Elk Creek. A homestead claim of family named Purcell, 1874. Gone to relatives in Kansas. She sat back and looked at what she'd written. Pattern. Clear pattern. The kind of pattern that required practice to execute, which meant this had been going on longer than the county records showed, or it had been tried elsewhere before, or both. She wrote at the bottom of the page, "Find Ruth Macklin." Then she closed the journal, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the morning. She was back at the ranch by 11:40. Rye was in the yard fixing a section of corral fence when she came up the road. He watched her drive without expression, waited until she'd stopped and climbed down. "What did you find?" he said. "Two other cases," she said. "Same pattern. Both widows. Both lost property through what Vane filed as debt recovery." She handed him the journal. "And a name, Ruth Macklin. She's the more recent one, 1876. She might still be in the county." Rye looked at the notes. "How do we find her?" "Enid Bray," Clara said. He looked up. "The woman who runs the general store in town," Clara said. "She knew who I was when I came in last week for supplies. Said she'd heard there was a new woman at the Callum Ranch. If she knows that she knows where Ruth Macklin is." "Probably," Rye said. "Definitely," Clara said. She took the journal back, went inside to check on Jessie. Rye stood in the yard for a moment looking at the road she'd come in on. 6 weeks. She'd been here 6 weeks, and she had two names, a pattern, and a plan. He went back to fixing the fence. Enid Bray ran the general store in the small cluster of buildings that served as the nearest thing to a town center for the ranching families north of Whitefish Bend. She was 55, broad-shouldered, with the warm efficiency of a woman who had spent decades being the person everyone came to when they needed something, whether that something was flour or information or someone to tell their troubles to. She knew who Clara was before Clara introduced herself. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "I heard you were at the Callum place." Clara introduced herself properly and set Jessie on the counter. Enid immediately began entertaining him with a string of wooden beads she produced from somewhere, without looking away from Clara, and said without preamble, "I'm trying to find Ruth Macklin." Enid's hands stilled for exactly 1 second. Then she continued with the beads. "What do you need with Ruth?" she said, carefully. "I think we have something in common," Clara said. "Something involving Silas Vane." Enid was quiet for a moment. She looked at Jessie, who was examining the beads with complete professional seriousness. "Ruth Macklin lives about 4 miles east of here," she said. "Down the Elk Creek Road. Small place. Blue door." She paused. "She doesn't talk about what happened with Vane. Hasn't since about 6 months after." "Why did she stop?" Clara said. Enid looked at her. "Her son," she said. "He was 3 then. He got sick. Real sudden, right about the time she'd started asking questions." She paused. "She doesn't say Vane had anything to do with it. She just says the boy got better once she stopped making noise." Clara stood very still. Jessie made a happy sound with the beads. "Thank you," Clara said. She took Jessie and the beads. Enid waved off the beads, said keep them, and walked out. Ruth Macklin's place was exactly where Enid had said. Small, neat in the way of a woman who maintained things not because anyone was watching, but because she had decided that was how things were maintained. Blue door, exactly as described. Clara knocked, waited. The door opened about 6 inches, and a woman looked out. 35 or so. Brown hair, eyes that had the look of someone who had learned caution the hard way and had decided that learning had been worth the cost. She looked at Clara, at Jessie, at the journal under Clara's arm. "You're from the Callum Ranch," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm Clara Holt. My husband was Amos Holt. He died in January. Silas Vane held our debt and tried to execute a labor contract through a forged signature. Ruth Macklin was quiet for a moment. "Come in," she said. Inside was a small main room. A boy of about 5 sat in the corner with a wooden toy. He looked at Claire and Jesse with the frank curiosity of children who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. They sat at Ruth's table, and Ruth talked. Not quickly, not easily. The way a person talked when they had kept something sealed for a long time, and the seal was releasing slowly one word at a time, with the care of someone who knew that once a thing was said, it couldn't be unsaid. She told Clara what had happened in 1876. The loan, the terms she'd understood versus the terms that appeared in the county filing. The labor contract that had arrived after her husband's death claiming an obligation he'd supposedly incurred. The pressure. The suggestions never explicit about what might happen if she continued to object. "My son got sick," she said. 3 years old. Fever out of nowhere. She looked at her hands. "I can't prove anything. I couldn't then. I still can't." She looked up. "But I know what I know." "Vane has done this at least 5 times, Claire said. Ruth looked at her. "At least," Clara said. "Possibly more before he came to this county." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I have a son," she said. "He's 5 now. He's fine now." "I know," Clara said. "I can't. I'm not asking you to do anything today," Clara said. "I'm asking you to tell me what you know, what you remember. The specific terms you agreed to versus what appeared in the county filing. Dates, numbers." She set the journal on the table. "I'm building a record." Ruth looked at the journal, looked at Jesse, who was sitting on Clara's lap watching the boy in the corner with enormous interest. "He's about 6 months, Ruth said. 7, Clara said. "Next week." Ruth Macklin picked up the pencil Clara had set beside the journal, and she started talking. Rye was at the barn when Clara got back. He heard the wagon and came out. She had the journal open before she'd finished climbing down. Ruth Macklin confirmed a pattern going back at least to 1874, she said. Same mechanism each time. Loan with hidden compound interest. Modified terms in county filing. Labor contract produced after the husband's death. And each time, she looked up. Each time there are children involved. Young children. And when the widow begins to push back, the children get sick. Rye went very still. "She can't prove that part," Clara said. "Neither can I. Yet." She looked at the journal. "But the financial fraud I can prove. The forgery I can demonstrate. The pattern across multiple victims I can document." She closed the journal. "I need one more thing. I need the original contracts. The ones Vane actually drew up before he modified them for the county filing." "He'd keep those," Rye said. "Bank safe, probably." "Yes," Clara said. "Or his associate would." Rye looked at her. "Cord Hatcher," she said. "He's been with Vane for 8 years. He executes everything, delivers documents, manages the properties after acquisition, handles the pressure. He knows exactly where everything is." She paused. "He also knows that when this unravels, Vane will need someone to absorb the consequences." "You think Hatcher knows that?" "I think Hatcher is smart enough to know that," she said. "And I think he's been smart enough to keep copies." Rye considered this for a moment. "Men like Hatcher don't give things away," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "They trade." She took Jesse inside. Rye stood in the yard thinking about Cord Hatcher, who was not a good man. That was clear. A man who had spent 8 years executing Silas Vane's business was not a man with a complicated moral landscape. He was a man who had made choices, repeated choices in the same direction for a long time. But there was always a but. A man who made those choices was also a man who understood with a clarity that honest men sometimes lacked exactly how the math of accountability worked. Who bore costs? Who didn't? And Vane, when cornered, would not bear them. Rye knew that type. He'd seen that type in the war. Officers who sent men forward and then, when things went wrong, produced careful explanations for why the outcome was someone else's responsibility. Hatcher had been going forward for 8 years. Sooner or later, Hatcher would do that math. The question was whether they could make it sooner. The threat came on a Wednesday. Rye was out at the north section of fence, a 2-hour ride from the cabin, checking a section that needed restringing before winter. He'd told Clara before he left. She nodded and said she'd have supper ready at 6. He was at the fence for 3 hours. Came back to find the yard empty, which was not unusual. Tied his horse, walked to the cabin, opened the door, and saw Clara standing in the middle of the main room with Jessie on her hip, and an expression on her face he had not seen there before. Not fear. Not fear exactly. The aftermath of fear. The look of a person who has held themselves together through something and is now, with the immediate thing past, allowing themselves to feel the weight of what just happened. What, he said. Cord Hatcher was here, she said. Rye went still. He came about an hour after you left, she said. He said he was in the area and thought he'd stop to see how we were settling in. She paused. He didn't come inside. He stood at the door and we talked for about 5 minutes. What did he say? He said Montana winters were very cold, she said. He said young children were particularly vulnerable to illness in cold weather. She looked at Jessie. He said it very pleasantly, very casually, like he was making conversation. Rye looked at her. She met his eyes. I did not show him that I was frightened, she said. I want you to know that. I told him I appreciated his concern and that I'd take appropriate precautions for the weather. And then I said I had things to do and closed the door. And then, Rye said, and then I sat down on the floor, she said, for about 2 minutes until my hand stopped. She straightened. And then I started writing down everything he'd said. Exact words, exact tone, everything. She handed him the journal. He read it. He handed it back. He threatened Jessie, Rye said. Without saying anything threatening, Clara said, which is how it works, which is how it always works. He said cold weather. He said vulnerable. He said it pleasantly. Her voice was even, completely even, except for a slight hardness at the edges that was not her usual voice. He could stand in front of a judge and read every word back and it would sound like a neighborly visit. Rye sat down at the table. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the journal, then at Clara, who was standing in the middle of her kitchen with her son on her hip, and the expression of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do and was waiting to say it out loud. You're not leaving, he said. No, she said. Even though he's trying to make me leave, she said. If I leave, he wins. And the next woman in my position, she stopped. Ruth Macklin was frightened into silence. She had good reasons to be, and Vane did it again. To me. She looked at Rye. If I'm frightened into silence, he'll do it again to someone else. Rye looked at her. I'm frightened, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am genuinely frightened. She set Jessie down on the blanket she'd spread on the floor and sat across from Rye. But frightened doesn't mean stopped. It just means I need to move faster. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Tell me what you need. Cord Hatcher, she said. We need him to understand that his protection depends on our success, not Vane's. I'll go see him, Rye said. No, Clara said. Not yet. First, I need to find something. She opened the journal. I went back to the county records last Thursday, she said. While you were moving the cattle, there's a complaint filed from 7 months ago. She slid the page toward him. The filing was dated January 14th, 1878. Complainant Amos Holt. Complaint modification of loan terms without borrower consent. Fraudulent alteration of county filing documents. Request for investigation. Status dismissed. Insufficient evidence. February 2nd, 1878. Amos had died on February 19th. Rye read it again. He set it down on the table very carefully. The way you set something down when you are being careful about what your hands do. He knew, he said. He knew, Clara said. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. He found out. He filed a complaint. It was dismissed. She looked at the paper. He was fighting it. He was sick, and he was fighting it, and the complaint was dismissed 17 days before he died. Rye looked at her face. She was not crying. Her eyes were bright, but it was not the brightness of tears. It was the brightness of a woman who has just learned something that has rearranged everything she thought she understood about a person she loved and is sitting with the full weight of that rearrangement. He wasn't careless, she said. No, Rye said. He didn't leave us in this situation because he was reckless or weak or... She stopped. I thought I spent months thinking that he must not have read the documents carefully enough, that he must have trusted Vane without checking, because that was the only explanation that made sense. She looked at the filing, and now I know that's not what happened. Clara. He read it, she said. He figured it out. He tried to do something about it, and he ran out of time. She was quiet for a moment. He ran out of time and he died, and Vane came for us anyway. Knowing the complaint had been dismissed, knowing there was no one left to fight. Except there was, Rye said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else about it. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said. The thing that needed to be said had been said, and they both understood it, and that was enough for now. The storm came 3 nights later. Not a dramatic storm. Not the first big snow of the season, just a heavy, cold front moving through the kind that hit the foothills in September and reminded everyone in the territory that summer had been a courtesy, not a permanent arrangement. Rain on the roof, wind finding the gaps in the walls, temperature dropping by 15 degrees between supper and bedtime. Jessie slept through it. Clara did not. Rye didn't either. He'd been awake since 2 in the morning, lying in the small room off the barn, listening to the rain and thinking about Cord Hatcher and the original contracts and the 7 months between Amos's complaint and today. He got up, made coffee, went to sit on the covered part of the porch. The rain came down steady and gray. He heard the cabin door. Clara came out in her coat with 2 cups of coffee, which told him she'd seen the light from his lamp, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. She handed him 1 cup and sat down in the other chair. For a while, they just sat. The rain fell. The mountains were invisible behind the weather. Amos, Rye said finally, at Chickamauga, he didn't just pull me up. She waited. Afterward, when I was recovering, Rye turned the cup in his hands. He wrote to my family. The army had told them I was dead. There was confusion. It happened sometimes. And somehow Amos found out, and he wrote to them, by hand, told them I was alive, told them I was going to be all right. He paused. I didn't find out until 6 months later. He never mentioned it. Clara was quiet. He just did it, Rye said, because it needed doing, because someone's family was wrong about whether their son was alive, and that was the kind of thing that should be corrected. He looked at the rain. That's who he was. Yes, Clara said softly. That's who he was. They sat in the rain sound for a while. I was angry at him, she said finally. After he died. Not the kind of anger you're supposed to admit, the kind you're ashamed of. She held her cup in both hands. I thought he'd been careless. I thought he'd trusted Vane without reading the documents and left us in an impossible situation, and I had a 6-month-old baby and no home, and I was... She stopped. You were allowed to be angry, Rye said. I know, she said, but not at him, not for that. She looked at the dark field in front of them. He was trying to fix it, right up until he couldn't anymore. He was, Rye said. She was quiet for another moment. He talked about you, she said. Not about what happened at Chickamauga, not in detail, but he'd say your name sometimes. When he was trying to explain something about the kind of person worth trusting. She paused. He said you were the kind of man who kept his word when no one was watching. Rye said nothing. He wrote it down too, she said. In the letters, he had Enid Bray keep. Rye looked at her. I haven't read them yet, she said. Enid mentioned them when I went back to see her this week. There are letters Amos sent her to keep. He told her they were for me, that she'd know when to give them to me. She looked at the rain. She said she'll give them to me when I ask, but I haven't asked yet. Why not? Clara thought about this for a moment. Because right now I need to be angry, she said. At Vane, I need that clearly. And I'm worried that if I read Amos's letters before this is finished, She stopped. I'll feel everything at once, and I need to feel one thing at a time until this is done. Rye looked at her for a long moment. That's probably right, he said. She nodded once. They finished their coffee. The rain kept coming. Cord Hatcher came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, 10 days after his visit, about winter weather and the health of young children. He didn't come announced. He didn't send word. He just rode up the road on a horse that wasn't his best one, which told Rye something, and he tied it at the post and knocked on the door with the knock of a man who has made a decision he's not sure about and is getting it done before he talks himself out of it. Rye answered. Hatcher looked at him. Is she here? He said. Rye said nothing. I'm not here for Vane, Hatcher said. I need you to understand that. I'm not here for Vane. Then why are you here? Rye said. Hatcher shifted. The uncomfortable shift of a man who is about to say something he has been not saying for a long time. Because I've been working for that man for 8 years, he said, and I know how this ends. I've seen how it ends. He paused. For everybody except him. Clara appeared in the doorway behind Rye. Hatcher looked at her. She looked at him. The last time they'd faced each other across a threshold, he'd said things about cold weather and sick children. They both knew that. It sat between them precise and acknowledged. You threatened my son, she said. I delivered a message, he said. I know that's the same thing. I'm not here to tell you it isn't. He looked at his hands, then at her. There's a woman who died, 1872, before Vane came to this county. Her name was Louise Greer. She had a labor contract. She had a child. He stopped. She didn't survive the winter. Silence. Vane had nothing to do with it, Hatcher said. That's what I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself. He looked at Clara directly. I have the original contracts. All of them. Yours, Ruth Macklin's, the Purcell family's 3 others. The originals before Vane modified the county filings. Clara said nothing. I've had them for 2 years, Hatcher said. I kept them because he stopped. Because I knew what he'd do when things got complicated. And I knew he'd need someone to blame. That someone being you, Rye said. Yes. So you want immunity, Clara said. He stopped. I want to not go to prison for something I mostly did by standing next to it while someone else did it. He looked at her. And I want this to stop. That too. I want it to be true that I said stop at some point before it was too late to matter. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She turned to Rye. He said, it's your decision. She looked back at Hatcher. The original contracts, she said. All of them. Ruth Macklin's specifically. Yes. And you'll testify to the modifications, the process by which the county filings were altered. Yes. I can't promise you immunity, she said. I'm not in a position to promise that. What I can tell you is that a man who comes forward with evidence and testimony is in a different position than a man who doesn't. And I'll say so clearly to whoever needs to hear it. Hatcher was quiet for a moment. That's enough, he said. Good, she said. She stepped back. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. You can tell me where the contracts are and how we get them. Hatcher looked slightly startled, as though he had been prepared for more resistance, and the lack of it was its own kind of difficulty. He came inside. That evening, after Hatcher had gone, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her journal and the notes she'd taken during his visit. Rye sat across from her with coffee he wasn't drinking, watching her work. She wrote for a long time. Then she stopped, looked up. Ruth Macklin, she said. I need to go back to her. She'll want to know about Hatcher. Tomorrow, Rye said. Tomorrow, she agreed. She closed the journal, looked at the table, then at him. I need to see Walt Pruitt, she said, the sheriff in Whitefish Bend. I know him, Rye said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. She folded her hands on top of the journal. I need someone with legal standing who can receive this evidence and knows what to do with it. Someone who isn't connected to Vane. Pruitt isn't, Rye said. He's been watching Vane for years. He just hasn't had anything to act on. Until now, Clara said. Until now, Rye said. She nodded. She sat there for a moment looking at the journal, looking at everything she'd built in the 2 months since they'd sat at the same table and she'd read a forged contract by lamplight and said, I'm going to need to see records. 2 months, the original contracts, Ruth Macklin's testimony, Amos's complaint, the county filings showing modifications, Hatcher's evidence and his agreement to testify. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to bring to a sheriff who had been looking for an opening for 4 years. She looked at Rye. He trusted you, she said. He looked at her. Amos, she said. He trusted you enough to write your name in the letters he had Enid keep. She paused. I haven't read them, but she told me they say to find you, if something happened. Clara, I'm not telling you that to make you feel responsible, she said. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I understand why he trusted you. She looked at him steadily. And that I do too. Rye looked at her. She held his gaze. He looked at the table. Then he said, Let's go see Pruitt. Walt Pruitt had been the sheriff of Whitefish Bend for 11 years. In that time, he had dealt with cattle theft claim, jumping 3 murders, 1 attempted bank robbery that had been so poorly executed that even the robbers seemed embarrassed by it, and approximately 400 smaller matters that were part of the general business of keeping a frontier county from coming apart at its seams. He had not dealt with Silas Vane, not because he hadn't tried, not because he hadn't noticed, but because noticing and proving were different things, and for 4 years, everything he'd noticed about Silas Vane had been precisely, carefully, professionally unprovable. When Rye Callum walked into his office on a Friday morning with a woman he'd never met, in a leather journal, in a request to sit down and look at some documents, Pruitt said yes before Rye finished the sentence. He read for 2 hours. He was a thorough reader, methodical. He didn't skim or skip or assume. He read the county filings, Ruth Macklin's written statement, the copy of Amos Holt's complaint and its dismissal, the documentation of interest rate modifications, and the sworn account of what Hatcher had offered and what he claimed to possess. When he finished, he set everything down and looked at Clara. You gathered all of this, he said. Yes, she said. In how long? About 2 months, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to build a case against Vane for 4 years, he said. I know, she said. You didn't have the original contracts. You didn't know about Ruth Macklin's specific experience, and you didn't have Cord Hatcher. No, Pruitt said. I didn't. He looked at Rye. She's something else. I know that too, Rye said. Clara ignored this. Can you receive Hatcher's testimony, she said, and the original contracts when he produces them? I can do better than receive them, Pruitt said. I can convene a county hearing, independent of the court. In Coldwater Flats, Vane has too much influence there. I can bring in the territorial court commissioner. He looked at Clara. But I need you to testify, not just the documents, your account, your husband's account, what happened at the auction and what happened after. I'll testify, Clara said. It won't be comfortable, he said. Vane has a lawyer. He'll come at your character, your living situation. He paused. You and Callum at the ranch. I know what he'll say, Clara said. Let him say it. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Give me 10 days to get the commissioner here and notify all parties. That means Vane gets notified too. Good, Clara said. Pruitt raised an eyebrow. If he knows it's coming, she said, he'll do something. And whatever he does will tell us something we don't already know. Pruitt looked at Rye again. Rye said nothing, just had the expression of a man who had been watching this happen for 2 months and had learned when to stay out of the way. 10 days, Pruitt said. 10 days, Clara agreed. What Vane did when he found out was exactly what Clara had predicted. He went after her character. The story moved through the county with the efficiency of a thing that had been prepared in advance. Clara Holt, a woman of questionable background, living unmarried with a man at a remote ranch, using a dead husband's name as cover for a scheme to defraud a legitimate banker of a lawful debt. Clara heard about it from Enid Bray, who drove out to the ranch specifically to tell her with the expression of a woman delivering news she's furious to be delivering. It's in both towns, Enid said, and he's got at least 3 people repeating it who know better. Clara nodded. Thank you, she said. You're not worried, Enid said. I'm angry, Clara said. That's different. She was. Genuinely, specifically angry in the way she'd been angry on the platform in Coldwater Flats, not at the humiliation of it, but at the mechanism. The casual ease with which Vane deployed reputation as a weapon against women who had no simple way to defend themselves from it. The assumption that she would retreat, that the story would be enough. It was not enough. She went back to Ruth Macklin. Ruth had heard the story too. She was sitting at her kitchen table when Clara arrived, her son playing in the yard, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking. He's doing it again, Ruth said. Yes, Clara said. My name is going to come up, Ruth said. In the hearing, people will know I talked to you. Yes, Clara said. I won't lie to you about that. Ruth looked at her son through the window. He was chasing a chicken with the total commitment of a 5-year-old who has decided this is the most important task of the morning. He's all right, Ruth said. He's been all right for 2 years. She looked at Clara. When he got sick, I was so frightened. I would have done anything. I did do anything. She set down the cup. I let Vane take my land and I kept my mouth shut, and I told myself I was protecting my son. She paused. I know I was, but I was also just scared. You were allowed to be scared, Clara said. I know, Ruth said, but he did it again, to you. She met Clara's eyes. He did it to you because I was quiet. You can't. I know I can't carry that, Ruth said. I know that's not how it works, but I can decide what I do now. She was quiet for a moment. I'll testify. Whatever you need. Clara looked at her. You're sure? I'm sure, Ruth said. She was not entirely sure. Clara could see that. She was a woman in the process of becoming sure, which was different and in some ways harder and considerably more real. Thank you, Clara said. Outside, the chicken escaped. The 9 days before the hearing were not quiet. 2 of Rye's fence sections on the south pasture were cut. Not by accident. Someone had gone along the line with wire cutters and done it deliberately, methodically in 4 separate places. It took him a full day to repair it. He didn't tell Clara immediately. Then he told her. Write it down, she said. I was going to, he said. Date, location, what you found, approximate time, everything. He wrote it down. 3 days before the hearing, a man came to the ranch who was not Hatcher, and not anyone Rye knew, and offered to buy the property for twice its assessed value in cash, effective immediately contingent on withdrawing from the upcoming hearing. He said it pleasantly, like a business proposition. Rye told him the answer was no. The man said he hoped Rye understood this was the better option. Rye told him the answer was still no. The man left. Claire had been in the barn with Jesse and had heard the whole thing through the open door. When she came out, Rye was still standing in the yard watching the road. Are you all right? She said. Fine, he said. That was Vane's lawyer, she said. I recognized the voice. He was at the auction. Rye looked at her. He negotiated the original contract with Amos, she said. In Coldwater Flats. Before Amos knew the terms had been changed. She paused. He's the one who presented the forgery to the county clerk. Can you prove that Enid Bray saw him twice? She adjusted Jessie on her hip. She'll say so. I asked her yesterday. Rye looked at her. You've been busy, he said. 2 months left on nothing before the hard freeze, she said. I need to be busier. Cord Hatcher delivered the original contracts on the evening before the hearing. He brought them in a leather satchel that looked like it had been hidden somewhere slightly damp for some time, which turned out to be accurate. He'd kept them in a waterproof case in a space behind his chimney, which was, he said, the one place in a house that Vane's men reliably never searched. Clara went through them at the kitchen table while Rye made coffee that nobody drank. 6 contracts, all original, all bearing loan terms that were materially different from the versions filed with the county. The differences were specific, consistent, and in each case structured the same way. The original interest rate was manageable, the county filed version was not, and the labor contract provision was absent from the original entirely. It had been added. In each case, added after the borrower signed, added to the county filing, and used as the mechanism for enforcement when the modified interest rates made repayment impossible. Clara sat with the Amos Holt contract in her hands for a long time. She read the original terms, $40, 8% interest, 2-year repayment period, no labor provision, no compound interest. She set it down on the table. She sat there in the lamplight and looked at it and thought about Amos reading these exact terms, agreeing to them, signing them, going home to tell her they'd secured a loan to get through a difficult winter and it was manageable, they'd be fine. He would have believed that, because these were the terms he'd agreed to. And then the winter came, and the terms changed, and he got sick and tried to fight it and ran out of time. She picked up the contract and added it to the stack. All 6, she said. All 6, Hatcher said. You'll testify to the modification process, how it was done, when, by whom. Yes. Including your own role in it. Yes. He said it flatly, without flinching. The acceptance of a man who has decided he's done calculating the cost of honesty. Including my own role. Clara looked at him across the table. She did not forgive him. She was not in the business of forgiving Cord Hatcher, who had threatened her son with the casual ease of someone who had done that before. But she recognized what he was offering and what it cost him, and she was clear-eyed enough to understand that some useful things came from people who were not good people, and that clarity about that was more valuable than comfort. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He left. Rye looked at her after he'd gone. You all right, he said. No, she said honestly. I'm tired and I'm angry and Jessie is going to be awake at 4 in the morning and the hearing is tomorrow. She pushed her hair back. But I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm doing it. She looked at him. That's enough for tonight. He picked up the contracts. I'll put these with the other documents, he said. She watched him do it. He moved through her kitchen with the ease of a man who had been in a space long enough to know where everything was without looking. 2 months she'd been here, and in 2 months the cabin had become not hers exactly. That wasn't the right word, but it had become a place where she was fully, which was different from the places she'd been since Amos died, where she'd been present, but not inhabiting, surviving, but not located. Here she was located. Rye, she said. He turned. She looked at him for a moment. When this is over, she said, I want to read the letters. He understood immediately. Amos's letters, he said. The ones Enid has. Yes. She folded her hands on the table. I've been waiting because I needed to do this first, without reading them yet, without feeling everything at once. She paused. But when it's done, I want to read them. Okay, he said. I want you to be there when I read them, she said. If that's, she stopped. He trusted you. He wrote your name in them apparently, and I think, she stopped again. I think it would be right to have you there. He looked at her. The lamp between them threw long shadows against the wall, and the night outside was a specific dark of a place far from cities, absolute and quiet, and Jesse was asleep in the next room. And in the morning there was going to be a hearing that would determine whether any of this had been worth it. I'll be there, he said. Good, she said. She went to bed. He stayed at the table for a while and thought about Amos Holt, who had hauled a 17-year-old out of the dirt at Chickamauga and written a letter to his family, and then years later dying, had written other letters and trusted a woman at a general store to know when to give them to the right person. Who had trusted Rye's name to mean something? Who had apparently decided at some point in the last weeks of his life that there was a future for his wife and son, and that he knew what it might look like. Rye didn't know what the letter said. He didn't know, and he had not asked, and he would not ask until Clara chose to share them. But he thought he understood in the general shape of things what kind of man wrote those letters. And he thought he understood what it meant that the man had written his name in them. The county hearing convened at 10 in the morning in the Whitefish Bend Meeting Hall, which was also used for town socials, circuit court sessions, and twice in recent memory as emergency shelter during severe weather. It had wooden benches, a raised area at the front where the commissioner and Pruitt sat, and by 10:15, more people than had fit in it comfortably since the weather incident. They had come from both counties. Ruth Macklin was there with her son, who sat beside her on the bench with the focused seriousness of a 5-year-old who understood something important was happening without knowing what. Enid Bray was there sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap and the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for this specific morning. Silas Vane was there with 2 lawyers from the territorial capital. Well-dressed, composed. He had the bearing of a man who has been in legal proceedings before and has never lost one, which was the kind of bearing that assumed it would continue to be accurate. Clara sat at the table across from him. Dark dress, hair up, Jessie with Rye on the bench behind her because she was not going to leave Jessie with anyone else this morning, and she was not going to let Vane or his lawyers or anyone else in the room see her make any accommodation for that. The commissioner read the formal charges: fraud, forgery, intimidation of debtors, modification of legal documents without borrower consent. Vane's lead lawyer immediately objected. The commissioner noted the objection, and then Clara began. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything. Methodically, in order. She knew which document she was presenting, at which moment, and why it came in that sequence, and what it established before the next one arrived. She had been a teacher. She understood that information landed differently depending on how it was organized. She started with the original Holt contract, the actual terms Amos had agreed to: $40, 8%, no labor provision, then the county filing. The modified terms: 24% compound interest, labor provision attached. The difference presented side by side required no interpretation. It was visible. Any person in the room who could read could see it. Vane's lawyer rose to challenge the provenance of the original contract. Hatcher testified to its provenance and to his own role. He sat in the witness chair with the flat steadiness of someone who has decided to tell the truth and is doing so with complete attention, leaving nothing out, including the parts that reflected badly on him. He described the modification process, the county filing procedure, the intimidation mechanism, the specific threat he had delivered to Clara Holt about cold weather and children. He said it all. The room was very quiet when he finished. Ruth Macklin testified next. She sat straight. Her hands were still. She spoke clearly and with the precision of a woman who has rehearsed what she was going to say many times in the past week, not to perform it, but to make sure she said exactly what was true and nothing she wasn't certain of. She described her experience in detail. When she was done, she looked at Clara for a moment. Clara looked back. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Then Enid Bray walked to the front of the room. She was carrying a small wooden box. She set it on the table in front of the commissioner and opened it. Inside were letters. 7 of them, she said. written by Amos Holt in the final months of his life, addressed to her, with instructions to keep them safe and to give them to his wife when the time was right. He said I would know when, Enid said. I know now. She handed the box to Clara. Clara held it for a moment. She did not open it. Not here, not in front of this room. The letters were private between Amos and whoever he'd intended them for, and she would read them in private with the person he'd apparently trusted to be there when she did. But she looked at the box for a long moment, and then she looked at the commissioner. My husband filed a complaint against Silas Vane in January of this year, she said. He was sick. He knew he was dying, and he was still fighting this. He found the modifications. He found the fraud. He filed the complaint. It was dismissed 17 days before he died. She set the box down. The fraud he identified is the same fraud documented in these contracts. The same mechanism, the same pattern. She looked at Vane directly. He had more time, he would have proven it himself. He just ran out of time. The room was very still. Vane's lead lawyer was on his feet. He talked for a while. Well-constructed arguments about document provenance and the reliability of a witness who was himself a confessed accomplice, and the character of a woman living in irregular domestic circumstances with a man who was not her husband. Vane said nothing himself. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the room with the expression of a man recalculating. And then Rye stood up. He didn't stand up to speak. He stood up the way he did things, without ceremony, without announcement. Just stood, and the room noticed, because a man who doesn't move much becomes conspicuous when he does. She's my wife, he said, very simply, not loudly, just stating a fact the way you stated facts when they were relevant to the information being presented. Clara turned and looked at him. He looked back at her. She was Amos Holt's wife, he said. She's been living in my home and keeping my accounts and raising her son. I asked her to marry me. She said yes. He paused. The wedding is in the spring, but she's my wife. Silence. Vane's lawyer seemed briefly uncertain what to do with this information, and then decided it didn't change his argument and continued. But the room had shifted. The commissioner noted everything. He read Amos's complaint and its dismissal. He reviewed the original contracts against the county filings. He heard Pruitt's account of the fence cutting and the purchase offer from Vane's lawyer 3 days before the hearing. He conferred with Pruitt for approximately 20 minutes. Then he came back to the room. The labor contract issued under the name Holt is hereby declared void, he said. The fraudulent modification of county filing documents constitutes a criminal matter which I am referring to the territorial court for prosecution. Mr. Vane, you are ordered to cease all collection activity related to the debts of Amos Holt, Ruth Macklin, and the 4 additional parties identified in this proceeding pending full review. He looked at Pruitt. Sheriff, I'll need those original contracts in territorial custody. Pruitt nodded. Vane stood up. He didn't make a speech. He was too controlled for that. He just stood and looked at the room, and then at Clara specifically. And in his expression, there was something she hadn't seen there before. Not anger. Something underneath anger. The look of a man who has had a mechanism that worked perfectly for a long time suddenly stopped working and is trying to understand how. He left with his lawyers. Nobody moved to stop him. Pruitt would deal with the formal arrest in due course with the territorial court's involvement through proper channels. That was how it worked, slowly and through proper channels and not always fully satisfying. But he was gone from this room, and the mechanism was broken. The meeting hall took a while to empty. People came to speak to Clara. Some of them she knew, most of them she didn't. They came the way people came when they had watched something significant happen and needed to stand near the person it had happened to, not because they had specific things to say, but because proximity was the best thing they had to offer. Ruth Macklin found her. Her son was on her hip. Jesse was on Clara's hip. The 2 children regarded each other with the mutual fascination of babies encountering other babies, which was a level of interest that adults tended to underestimate. It's not over, Ruth said. No, Clara said. The territorial court will take time. His lawyers will delay. He might not, she paused. It might not end the way we want it to end. But it's different now, Ruth said. Yes, Clara said. It's different now. Ruth looked at her son. 2 years ago, I made a decision, she said, and I've been carrying it. She looked at Clara. I don't know if what I did today cancels that out. I don't think it works that way. I don't think it does either, Clara said. But it's something, Ruth said. Yes, Clara said. It is. They stood there for a moment, two women with children on their hips in a meeting hall that was slowly clearing in a county where the mechanism had broken. That was something. Rye was waiting outside. Clara came through the door and found him on the steps. Jesse's coat in his hands because she'd handed it to him before going inside, and he'd been holding it since. He looked at her face. She looked at his. Done, he said. This part, she said. He handed her the coat. She put it on Jesse, who accepted this without enthusiasm. They walked to the wagon. She climbed up. He handed Jesse up and then climbed up himself. For a moment, neither of them said anything. You told them we were married, she said. I did, he said. We're not married, she said. No, he said. You said the wedding was in the spring. I did. She looked at him. He looked at the horses. That requires me to actually agree to it, she said. Yes, he said. It does. Silence. Rye Callum, she said. Clara Holt, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Was that a proposal, she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small object. A ring, silver, simple. The kind that a man bought from a town jeweler with exact specifications about what he wanted and what he didn't want, in a very clear sense of which of the two was the right one. He'd had it since last week. He hadn't known when to give it to her. And then in that room, he'd stood up and announced a wedding, and now apparently it was now. It's a proposal, he said. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Jesse grabbed for the ring with the focused determination of an infant who wanted everything that was shiny and small, and Rye pulled it back gently, and Jesse expressed his opinion about this, and Clara took Jesse and redirected his attention to a button on her coat, and by the time all of that was sorted, the moment had technically passed, except it hadn't. Yes, she said, very simply, the same way she'd said yes to everything she'd actually meant. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it. It's a good ring, she said. I know what I want, he said. You do, she agreed. And then she leaned against him just slightly, just enough, and he stayed where he was, solid and present, which was what he was and what he had always been and what he had apparently always been going to be to her in particular. The wagon went down the road. The ring caught the light. Jesse fell asleep before they'd gone a mile. They picked up the letters from Enid Bray on the way home. Enid came out to the wagon to hand over the box. She looked at Clara's hand. Well, she said. Yes, Clara said. Amos would... Enid started, stopped. Her eyes went bright. He would have said something very dry and funny about this. He was good at that. He was, Clara said. He was also right about the important things, Enid said. He said you'd figure it out, whatever it was that needed figuring. She went back inside. Clara held the box in her lap the rest of the way home. That evening, after Jesse was down and the cabin was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the box. 7 letters. She looked at the handwriting on the first one and had to stop for a moment. Just stop. The lurch of recognition that happened when you saw the handwriting of someone who was gone, the fact that a hand that no longer existed had made these specific marks, and they were still here, still perfectly themselves. She breathed. Rye sat across from her. He didn't say anything, didn't prompt her, just sat there with his coffee and his steadiness, which was the thing about him that had been true from the beginning, that he was present in a way that didn't require management, that didn't need anything from you, except that you do whatever you were going to do. She read the first letter. It was practical, written in early October when Amos knew he was sick, but didn't yet know how sick. It described alone the modification he'd found the complaint he was preparing. It was clear and organized and precise, and exactly the way Amos approached everything that mattered to him. The second letter was written in November, more personal. He talked about Jesse, about what he hoped for him, about the winter he wouldn't be there for. She set it down, breathed, picked it up again. The third letter was dated January. He knew by January. She read it slowly and found what Enid had said was there. He wrote about Rye. He wrote about Chickamauga, about the letter he'd sent to Rye's family, about the quality he'd recognized in Rye even then, 17 years old, and in the dirt, which was not courage. Exactly courage was common in soldiers, but something more specific. A kind of reliable presence. The quality of a person who, when they said they were going to do something, did it. Who kept his word, not because anyone was watching, but because that was the sort of person he was. He wrote, "I trust Rye Callum with the things that matter." And then he wrote, "Clara will figure out what to do. She always does. But she should have someone who stays." That was the word he used. Stays. She set the letter down. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked at Rye. He looked at her. She slid the letter across to him. He read it. When he finished, he set it down and folded his hands on top of it and looked at the table for a moment. Then at the lamp, then at her. "He said you always figured out what to do," Rye said. "He was right," she said. "Usually. He said he trusted me with the things that matter. He was right about that, too." "Clara, I know," she said. "I know what it means. I know what he was saying." She looked at the ring on her hand, the simple silver one. "He wasn't telling me what to do. He was—" She paused. "He was giving me something, in case I needed it. Permission, maybe. To not be alone." She looked up. "He knew I'd fight about accepting it." "He knew you well," Rye said. "He did," she said. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp burned. Jesse breathed in the next room. Outside, Montana settled into itself in the way it did at night, enormous and quiet and completely uninterested in human arrangements, except insofar as they either survived its winters or didn't. "He would have liked you," she said. "I know," Rye said. "I liked him." She sat back. She looked at the 6 remaining letters and decided they would wait for another evening, another quiet hour when she had the right kind of energy for them, which was not tonight's energy, which was exhausted and relieved and complicated in all the ways that days like today left a person. "We should sleep," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up. She gathered the letters and put them carefully back in the box and set the box on the shelf where she could see it. Then she stopped. "He was a good man," she said, not to Rye specifically, to the room, to whatever remained in the air of someone who had lived in it for a while and left something behind. "Yes," Rye said. "And I'm going to be all right," she said. "Yes," Rye said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Good night, Rye," she said. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went to bed. He stayed at the table a while longer. He thought about a 19-year-old on a Georgia battlefield who had hauled a stranger out of the dirt and never mentioned it afterward. Who had written letters because they needed writing? Who had, in the last months of his life, done the thing he did best, which was to look at a complicated situation and identify the next necessary action, and then to execute it quietly without anyone needing to know? Rye picked up the lamp, looked around the cabin, the shelf with the box on it, the chairs, the table, the sound of Jesse breathing in the next room. He'd been in this cabin for 6 years. He hadn't known it was supposed to feel like this, but he knew now. He blew out the lamp. He went to sleep. And in the spring, when the snow came off the mountains and the creek ran high and the garden was ready to be planted, they got married in the yard of the Callum Ranch. Walt Pruitt was there. Ruth Macklin was there with her son, who spent the ceremony attempting to befriend Jesse with mixed results. Enid Bray was there with flowers from her own garden. It was not a large wedding. It was not a complicated one. Clara wore blue. Rye wore his good coat. Jesse wore an expression of general indifference to ceremony that he would maintain for approximately the next 4 years until he understood what ceremonies were. When it was done, they stood on the porch and looked out at the field. The field was the same field it had always been. Gallatin foothills, pine at the edge, creek to the south, mountains in the distance, permanent and white-tipped and completely unimpressed by human events. Clara's hand was in Rye's hand. The ring caught the spring light. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Jessie made a sound of general announcement from her other arm. "He's hungry," she said. "He's always hungry," Rye said. "He's a growing boy," she said. "He is," Rye said. "He'll be riding by next spring." "Don't rush him." "I'm not rushing him. I'm planning." "There's a difference." "For some things," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the field was in front of them, and the mountains, and the creek, and the spring that had come after the winter, that had come after everything that had led here, step by step from a battle in Georgia in 1863, to a platform in a dusty street in 1878, to a kitchen table and a box of letters and a ring chosen with specific intention. It had not been simple. It had not been what either of them expected. But it was here. And they were both the kind of people who, when something was worth keeping, kept it. So they stayed.